Toyota Material Handling is now providing a factory rebate of up to $2,500 when you trade in a Toyota or a competitive unit. Now, through September 30th, 2024, trade in your forklift and get a new industry-leading Toyota forklift. This rebate applies to electric and internal combustion models. Unlock your upgrade today by visiting toyotaforklift.com. That's toyotaforklift.com, or click the link in the show notes.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Tom Nightingale, who is the CEO at AFS Logistics, also involved in CSCMP and the work boards as well. And AFS Logistics is a transportation 3PL, non-asset based, and they've been in business for over 40 years. So we're going to dive into a little bit of Tom's experience here, AFS's experience, and kind of how the transportation and warehouse kind of come together, and how that relationship is, and how those different types of things kind of operate, go hand in hand, and how they can help improve each other and drive value for one another. So, Tom, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Great. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, it's good to have you here, definitely. And, I gave my little intro here on AFS Logistics, but why don't you say, you're the CEO, you're the guy, right? So you know the most about AFS Logistics. So why don't you give us kind of just a brief overview of what it is you guys do?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure I know the most. That's typically not the thing that people would attribute to me. But I will tell you that AFS is a 42-year-old, as you mentioned, non-asset based, non-asset biased 3PL. We specialize in four things. We do LTL, parcel, transportation management, and freight audit and payment. And freight audit and payment is probably one of the things we're best known for as one of the largest freight audit and payment companies in the world, but certainly have excellent core competencies in the other three disciplines of LTL, parcel, and transportation management as well.
Interesting. And definitely, I think it's great to be able to provide those services. And obviously we see, as I mentioned there in the beginning, where we have transportation, warehousing, they kind of end up going hand in hand, right? Things get stored in the warehouse, and then they have to get from warehouse to store, warehouse to customer, or warehouse to warehouse in some instances, and that all has to happen through transportation. So why don't you tell us from the AFS perspective, what is kind of the role of the warehouse provider, and how does it relate kind of into that overall transportation ecosystem?
Yeah, I've always felt like warehouses, and this, in part goes back to some of my background in prior roles and with the Warehouse Education Research Council, but it really serves as the critical linchpin in transportation. And when you think about it, warehouses serve as the most critical components of the entire supply chain. And the reason I say that is that there's no such thing as a singular warehouse. So there are so many different flavors and varieties, whether it's an origin consolidation warehouse, a destination deconsolidation warehouse, a pallet in, pallet out warehouse, a warehouse that provides value-add services, kitting, one that's purpose-built to serve the needs of the supply chain. Everybody is a little bit different. And as a result, I think the transportation ecosystem that serves it has to be different, and they have to be so fluid and so adept at all modes of transportation just to keep that supply chain flowing. And, as I look at today's warehouses, they're probably adopting and adapting to more change faster than they ever have, at least in my career, because I think consumer behaviors have changed so quickly.
Yeah.
Modes of transportation are changing really quickly now. they've got to accommodate everything from e-commerce and fast fulfillment. And, now a warehouse that might have, historically been designed just to handle an inbound through rail, now all of a sudden has, not only rail coming inbound and truckload going outbound, but they might be grappling with, how do you handle truckload inbound, LTL going outbound, parcel going outbound, courier, even in some cases. And that comes with more doors, more automation, longer and tighter labor scheduling. There's just so much that goes on in the warehouse today, as I think warehouses really adapt to consumer needs, and as a result have so many different transportation modes at their disposal that they probably didn't even think of 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you have a great point there. I think the consumer behavior has been changing so rapidly that, we're trying to keep up in the industry, right? And that means that we have to kind of change and adopt to new technologies and things and different ways of doing business and processes overall to be able to meet some of those customer behavioral changes, which, essentially end up becoming customer demands in a sense, right? Because they want it that way. Somebody does it for them that way and they get used to that, right? So, in that regard, and you mentioned, multiple different transportation modes and availability, all the way from, individual couriers up to, FTLs and rail, whatever the case may be. You guys are non-asset based, but if you look at warehouse providers, what's your perspective and thoughts around, should warehouse providers be investing and owning in transportation assets? Is that any benefit to them? Is it a negative? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's always going to come down to an individual business model and a choice on the part of ownership. I think the natural imbalance that occurs within transportation makes transportation asset ownership a pretty expensive proposition. I've seen a lot of warehouse operators through my career get into asset ownership during periods when capacity was tight. And then while their intent was noble and they wanted to serve those customers and they felt like they had good, strong value proposition because they wanted to internalize that margin that was going on with the transportation provider community. But then when the market turns and volumes drop and you're saddled with those assets and the volumes soften, and then you have no head haul to balance with your backhaul or backhaul to balance with your head haul, it gets really, really tough. And those assets can become an albatross around your neck. And, basically in transportation, if you've got more than 10% empty miles, you cannot make money. And if you don't have that well-balanced head haul and backhaul, it's tough. So I would generally guide warehouse operators to stay away from it and make that head haul, backhaul dilemma more of the problem of the transportation providers network than your problem, because it is a problem. It's hard to operate that way. I think there's always going to be a place for, yard hustlers and for, plant to plant shuttles and things of that nature where it's really, really predictable. But generally speaking, unless there is some unique part of your business in the warehouse that calls for that level of asset adoption, I would guide against it. It's a tough business, and it's a really different model to operate under.
Yeah, and definitely a higher investment too, right? To have to invest in those assets, and then we talked about kind of the rapid change of things too as well. Imagine you invest in all these trucks, and then all of a sudden the business model needs to change, and now it makes more sense for you to have Sprinter vans versus trailers or something like that. So I think it makes sense there. So tell us a little bit about kind of from that perspective of, not necessarily if you're not having those predictable loads and you're able to, keep them full on most runs, how does a warehouse provider, operator, how do they kind of, I guess, marry up with their transportation providers to not only, make sure that they can do what they need to do, but then also potentially provide and drive more value for their customers, just from like an overall supply chain perspective.
Yeah, and I think the key is knowing what you're good at and sticking to that wherever you can, and wherever you can't, it's pulling in the right experts. If I think about the transportation networks, just broadly speaking, I think if you've got that network of providers that can help, and in some cases, a client may dictate their providers, but in other cases, if you know how to contract for those services, when you can see an increase in any given area and have somebody who is at your disposal, who can pull in the right set of resources, who can be nimble for you, that's really the best strategy, is to see ahead of things and then pull in the right set of providers. And we've seen an increase really in the last probably 10 years as a company, 4 of which I've presided over, where we get warehouse providers who are coming to us because they're saying, hey, look, I'm not going to be the expert in parcel. I'm not going to be the expert in LTL. I really don't consider freight audit and pay to be my core competency, but I need to provide those services to be a full service provider for my customer. And in those situations, then we get down to kind of 2 different flavors. Some who want it white labeled, and we do provide those services. Others who are really happy to say, look, this is the expert. You guys go connect directly. We'll manage what's inside the 4 walls, and they'll just make us more successful. So it does vary situation by situation, but that would be my best advice to anybody that wants to be that full service provider, is don't bite on the intuitive hook of going out, getting the assets, becoming the expert. Just hire the experts. Yeah. I think that's such a good thing. And I think that's like great advice just in business in general, right? Just, focus on what you're good at and then hire for all the other things. And I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to create that relationship too, because, having that relationship that's reliable, if you're a warehouse provider, and then you can go out there and tell your clients that, like, well, we can certainly, get these shipments out on time. And then all of a sudden you're bouncing around through different providers and, just trying to get lowest rates and things like that, where you be able to create a consistent relationship. You're going to have more value, right? Because now, like, you've promised something to the customer, and then if you're not delivering on that promise, then it's not going to be great, right? So I think it's very interesting to be able to develop and cultivate that relationship, and like you said, leverage the expert for what they're an expert at, and focus on what you're good at to be able to make a more comprehensive, overall better solution and answer for your customer. So in that regard too, as you're creating these kind of comprehensive solutions and trying to, make customers' supply chains better and more robust, more valuable to them. We have a question actually that came from LinkedIn from John McClyman. So shout out to John. But he asked, what do you feel are the 2 biggest value added services in logistics or warehousing right now? And I think that kind of goes in line with what we're talking about here in terms of, creating this relationship and being able to leverage different parts, like if you're a warehouse provider, leveraging transportation. But I'm curious your thoughts. What do you think are some of the biggest value added services that you could have right now in logistics or warehousing?
We'll be back after a quick break.
When it comes to systems, you want something that will start showing results fast. You're looking for a tool that can enable your 3PL or warehouse to get to the next level. So why wait? That's why Carton Cloud provides supported, fast onboarding that can have your WMS up and running in hours, not months. Jump into Carton Cloud's easy-to-use workflows for all of your services, including cross-docking, serialized inventory tracking, e-commerce order fulfillment, and more. This software is built by logistics people for logistics people, and those logistics people are standing by to help train you and support you so that you can be successful with your customer. With 24/7 real-time reporting and free online training, you need to check out Carton Cloud for your operation. Take the next step in your operation by heading to cartoncloud.com/free-demo or click the link in the show notes.
Yeah, so I would say one is having that network of external experts, people outside the four walls. So knowing that, if your client needs, a new site location study, what are the labor factors, tax factors, transportation factors that would go into that? Knowing that your customer is going to need to change modes of transportation because their product mix has started to change, being able to negotiate the best possible rate. Anything outside the four walls, I think is one of those two things that I would really put a strong emphasis on. And the second thing I would probably put an emphasis on would be inside the four walls. And that's enabling them to postpone as long as humanly possible. That customization, that value add, making sure that, whether it's barcode and packaging, things of that nature that are going to allow them to ship a more homogeneous inbound inventory in that then feels customized once it comes outside the four walls. I had some prior experience in a good size evaluated warehousing and distribution company that did everything from putting keys on the keyboard so that our technology customers could ship a blank keyboard, but yet if it was going into Poland, it had the L with a line through it. If it was going into Spain, it had the N with the tilde over it. But yet when it came into us, it was just a blank keyboard. And those things are things that now in an interest rate environment like today, just make a warehouse provider so much more valuable because that reduces the amount of inventory carrying costs that the customer has. And right now, inventory is one of the largest components of the supply chain. So,
yeah, I think that's great insight there because I think that is such a huge thing. I mean, especially as you look at like you said, the cost and the interest rate of that inventory itself, being able to reduce essentially and, not end up with like some excess inventory or, you ordered too many keyboards for Poland, as you mentioned, and now all of a sudden I got, 10 pallets I'm stuck with of just these like Polish keyboards. What am I going to do with them? You're able to have that kind of variability. And I think I'm seeing like a lot of that too in the space. I had a chance to visit with a 3PL and they're doing all kinds of customization stuff with embroidery and laser engraving. And it certainly reduces not only that overall inventory that you have to hold, but then all those carrying costs that go along with it too. So I think that's a great thing to add in there. So very interesting. I mean, adding these value add services and creating these relationships between the transportation and the warehousing side of the supply chain to really drive additional value. And I'm curious, one part of that relationship, I think, is sometimes there can be like some tension at times, right? Is between the truckers themselves and the shippers themselves. And, as you look at some of those things, and I've seen like reviews before where it's like the truckers are going on Google review and they're saying like, oh, this place makes you wait a long time. There's no bathroom. I'm never going to deliver to this place again. Like, or this kind of stuff. I mean, how do you kind of, because from a shipper's perspective, like that's important, I think, right? Because the shipper, if you have a driver that's like, oh, I'm never going to come back there again, like, that's potentially like creating a service disruption or something for you. It could be a potential negative when people maybe won't want to pick up. It'd be harder to get your loads placed and things like that. I mean, how do warehouse providers become what, they call a shipper of choice? I mean, what are some of maybe like the common mistakes that are leading these truckers to leave these bad reviews for these warehouses and things of that nature? What do you see out there?
Yeah, and I'll touch base on four things there, but then I'll probably be a little bit controversial as well. I think number one, it's effectively managing the load and unload so that delays don't happen. That's an obvious choice. It's embracing technology to feed in the orders through a good state-of-the-art TMS that's giving everybody visibility as to where the trucker is so that you can prepare the inventory for loading and unloading, and the labor for loading and unloading. It's being flexible, but at the same time being as consistent as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the fourth thing is being early in booking whenever possible. Now, I fully appreciate and understand the fact that if you are providing services to a company as a warehouse provider and not just a warehouse of a company, that gets even harder. It's already hard to begin with because of the S&OP process. But wherever possible, be as early as we get as a warehouse can when ordering those trucks in. And having said all that, this is where I think I get a bit more controversial. And I think that shipper of choice, by and large, is a platitude. It almost doesn't exist. And the reason I say that is a carrier, if they're not hauling that freight today, they don't know what they're bidding on. And there's no universal common metric for how long the driver had to wait. And yeah, you might read a Google review, to your point.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good, but it's anecdotal. I would love it if somebody would please produce kind of that universal common denominator, some set of variables that we could all rate differently what matters most to us in our transportation businesses. Is it wait time? Is it driver facilities? Is it load, unload? Is it dock levelers? Is it, a requirement around trailer age? Is it any number of different things? Could be even payment after the load's been delivered. Everybody has different variables. Everybody has different weightings on things, and yet there is no common denominator. And I would love it if somebody would really publish that, put that out there so we can all figure out what freight is it that we are pricing out. Because, our worst nightmare isn't getting there and waiting. Our worst nightmare is having to turn that business back.
Yeah.
Because the treatment of the driver was just so out of standard or out of what we thought we were going to get when we bid on it.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and being able to have that visibility kind of ahead of time, I think would be a great thing. Like, to your point, to be able to see that almost like a shipper score or something like that, right? Where you would see that and you would be like, oh no, like this is not somebody like I want to do business with. Cause I think to your point, I mean, it's the Google review is just, it's just like a restaurant too. I mean, it's the same thing, right? More than likely someone that has a bad experience is going to leave a review, but how many people are having good experiences that they're not leaving a review, right? So I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to see that as kind of like a common denominator, as you mentioned, to be able to see that. So as we look at these kind of things and we see, just the overall state of the market, I mean, I think that's something that's kind of always in discussion, right? Is the transportation market and the rates and things of that nature. As you look at the market right now, I mean, what are you seeing out there? Are there potential opportunities for warehouse providers? Are there things that they should be cautious about? I mean, what's happening out there in the market right now?
Well, so we at AFS work collaboratively with TD Cowen, and we publish an AFS TD Cowen freight index. And we break the market apart a little bit differently. We look at parcel, both express and ground. We look at truckload, and we look at less than truckload. And that's a little bit unique. We are forward looking in it. Now, we do this off of an AI and machine learning based instance of our $11 billion worth of freight that we audit and pay. So we get some unique visibility into where trends are headed. And as we look out into this quarter, we see the parcel market, still sagging. The demand is not where it was, obviously, during the pandemic. We're seeing cost reductions to generate some additional profits to help offset some of the incremental integration and labor costs that the parcel providers are seeing right now. Specifically, without diving into just tons and tons of detail, we've seen fuel surcharges become really weaponized. We've seen delivery area surcharges, applying to broad swaths of the public, and no longer just being used to target, the guy in the middle of nowhere in Montana. That they are now actually affecting really broad swaths of the population, as well as the ongoing fuel surcharges and carrier surcharges that were implemented during the pandemic. So I would say you're going to see Parcel Express continuing to improve in its pricing environment while the volumes are decreasing, except for those customers who are wise enough to deploy the resources they need to help mitigate some of those surcharges. I think Ground will overall get to a new historic high and it can reach that same level that it reached in Q1 of last year. But look at less than truckload, which again is an area that we over-index in. We're seeing about a flattish economy for rates, 0.4% increase from Q1 into Q2. So not a lot of action there, despite the bankruptcy of Yellow and some of those facilities now coming online. If there was a real spike in the PMI, we might see some better recovery there. But overall, I think the LTL market will stay relatively flat. And truckload has been bouncing a bottom really since the beginning of Q2 of last year, which is when we started to fall for that. And, it pretty much stays there, up one quarter, down the next quarter. At the moment, we're seeing enough capacity coming into the market in the form of tractors that is more than offsetting the bankruptcies that we're seeing on the lower end of the market. So the big guys are gaining, the little guys are exiting, and the big guys are gaining at a rate fast enough to more than soak up any recovery in the economy overall. And obviously, we haven't seen as much recovery in the economy as we would like to see.
Yeah. Interesting there. And I think, it's interesting too, because like you said, the Ground and, parcel side of things is it seems to continuously be increasing on the rate side, which, gets harder and harder, especially for companies that, are trying to offer free shipping or, very low shipping, because the consumer has become so attuned to that, right? That's like the expectation in a sense. So when we look at that, and especially as, we go into this year, like peak season during the holidays and things like that, we see a lot of different type of kind of regional parcel carriers or startup parcel carriers that are trying to do things a little differently to help alleviate some of those costs, especially around e-commerce shipments and things of that nature. That requires like some flexibility there, right? To look at, your modes in a little different way, your carrier in a little different way. How would you advise a warehouse provider to, look at the upcoming peak season and potentially either add in a different type of carrier, different type of mode to help alleviate some of that cost, or even just give them a little bit of contingency in a sense too?
Yeah, we're seeing across our 1,600 clients, we are seeing a lot of them raising their minimums for free or reduced shipping times, opting for slower services, and in many cases, bringing in alternate carriers, playing, one parcel carrier off of another parcel carrier wherever possible, try to drive those costs down, try to give them some optionality in their transportation system so that if somebody gets backed up during peak season, they're fine. Now, having said that, we do think that there'll be a little bit of a peak this year, more so than last year, but not anything like what we saw during the pandemic. I don't anticipate that any of the carriers will have any problems handling the peak volumes this year. But it is nice to have some optionality and in the process, try to drive down some of those surcharges and the net landed costs that I talked about earlier.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's great to have that a little bit of flexibility and optionality, as you mentioned in there as well, but it's certainly becoming challenging a bit to help and kind of continuously accommodate this free shipping aspect and be able to do that. So very interesting insights with you here, Tom, and appreciate you coming on the show and talking to me today. It's really interesting to kind of talk about the balance between the transportation side and the warehouse side. I mean, I think they go so hand in hand together, and it's great to get some insight on like how to leverage that better from a warehouse perspective and just create better overall relationships. And like you said, be able to leverage that expertise to help essentially drive better value to your customers and clients at the end of the day. So very interesting to talk to you, Tom. And if people are interested in connecting with you or finding out more about AFS Logistics, what's the best way to do that?
They can either email me directly at tnightingale, NIGHTINGALE @afs.net, or just hit us up on our website, afs.net, or follow us on LinkedIn, obviously.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it. So Tom, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.